I came back to consciousness under fluorescent lights that made everything look honest in a cruel way. The ER ceiling tiles were stained in the corners. A monitor ticked beside me, steady, unimpressed. Someone had shaved a strip of hair near my temple. My mouth tasted like metal. I learned later it was internal bleeding from a ruptured ovarian cyst. But at that moment, all I knew was that I was awake, and my body felt like it had been rearranged without my permission. Calvin Moore entered before I was fully there. He didn't knock. He never did. He held a folder thick with insurance printouts, the kind designed to make people feel small. Copays circled in red, out-of-network fees underlined twice. He stood at the foot of my bed like a supervisor clocking overtime. "You know what this is costing us?" he said, already angry, already convinced. My mother, Janet Brooks, followed him in and stopped by the wall. She folded her hands as if prayer were a physical position you could assume to avoid responsibility. She didn't look at me. She watched the IV drip instead, counting seconds. Calvin kept talking, about how emergencies always seemed to find me, about how convenient it was that I couldn't hold a full-time job, about how people my age learned to push through discomfort instead of dramatizing it. I tried to speak. The words came out slow, like they were walking uphill. He leaned closer. Too close. His breath smelled like mint and resentment. "Stop milking it," he said. "You're not dying." Then he shoved the bed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The wheels rolled. My shoulder slipped. I went over the side, half tangled in tubing, and the room exploded into sound. Alarms, footsteps, a nurse swearing softly as she caught the IV pole before it hit the floor. Calvin lifted his hands immediately. "Family stress," he said to security, as if that explained gravity. She startled me. Across the curtain, a voice cut through the noise. Clear. Old. Unafraid. "Call the police," the woman said. I saw everything. Her name was Eleanor Price, 81, sharp eyes, the kind that had been paying attention long before the rest of us learned to. As they took Calvin out, still explaining himself, something in me settled. This wasn't an exception. It was a pattern. Financial pressure followed by physical force. Confusion mistaken for consent. When Nurse Megan Lewis came to discharge me hours later, she didn't say much. She just slid a thin sheet into my folder, Domestic and Financial Abuse Hotline, that met my eyes long enough to make it deliberate. I understood then. Survival wasn't luck. It was documentation. And I had been collecting longer than anyone realized. 5 years earlier, my father died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning that smelled like burnt coffee and rain. He collapsed in the driveway while checking the mailbox. By the time the ambulance arrived, the envelope with the mortgage statement was still in his hand. That debt became the first thing people mentioned when they spoke about him afterward. Not his steadiness. Not how he fixed things without announcing it. Just the numbers he left behind. That was when Calvin Moore appeared. He started showing up at the local church on Sundays, always a little louder than necessary, shaking hands like he was sealing deals instead of greeting neighbors. He drove a new pickup truck that still smelled like plastic. A heavy watch sat loose on his wrist, catching the light when he gestured. He talked easily about real estate, flips, rentals, smart leverage. Words designed to sound like competence without inviting questions. My mother listened the way she always did when someone promised certainty. 8 months later, she married him. After the wedding, Calvin suggested we simplify. Joint accounts, centralized bills. "One point of control," he said, tapping the kitchen table with his knuckle like punctuation. It made sense to my mother. She liked things that sounded tidy. I noticed that my name came off accounts first. The workers' compensation insurance from my accident arrived a month later. A check meant to cover missed wages and physical therapy. Calvin insisted it would be safer if he deposited it, just until things stabilized. He said it casually, like he was offering to carry a heavy bag. I never saw that money again. Mail started going missing after that. Bank letters I remembered seeing in the preview email never made it to the counter. Statements stopped arriving. When I asked, Calvin said I must have misplaced them. He said it often enough that my mother repeated it for him. At night, the garage door would slam. The sound traveled through the house like a warning. Calvin's voice followed, sharp, contained, angry in a way that meant it had been rehearsed. He talked about money like it was a personal insult. Neighbors later told me they heard it too. Doors, shouting, the word ungrateful carrying farther than it should. I stayed invisible. That was my role. The daughter who didn't quite land right. The one who needed help. My younger half-brother, Calvin's son from a previous marriage, became the contrast. New laptop for college, weekend trips framed as networking. Everyone nodded at the difference like it was natural law. What they didn't see was what I was building quietly. Every missing statement was saved as a digital notice. Every redirected check logged. Dates, amounts, names, screenshots of accounts I technically no longer had access to, taken before passwords were changed. I learned the language of forms, how signatures look when they've been guided, how transfers leave trails even when envelopes disappear. I didn't confront. I documented. When my mother signed a power of attorney she didn't fully read, I scanned it. When Calvin refinanced the house using figures that didn't match our actual balance, I requested copies for my records. When he talked about taxes like they were optional, I wrote down the phrasing. Paper insurance, I called it privately. Not protection through confrontation, but through accumulation. Proof that didn't argue. It waited. By the time the hospital happened, the file was already thick. Not enough to scare anyone yet. Enough to end things when the time came. Watching Calvin being escorted out of the ER, still explaining, still certain his version would land, I understood something clearly for the first time. Men like him rely on confusion, on people being too tired, too embarrassed, too isolated to line the facts up straight. I wasn't confused anymore. I went home with bruises I could point to and documents I didn't need to explain. The garage stayed quiet that night. For once, there was no shouting, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of me uploading files to a place he would never see. The collapse wouldn't be loud. It would be orderly. I worked 2 jobs and still learned how poverty can be manufactured. During the day, I folded shirts under fluorescent lights at a retail outlet that smelled like plastic and perfume. At night, I sat at a second-hand desk in my childhood room, doing freelance graphic design for clients who never remembered my name, but always remembered my invoice number. Logos, pitch decks, quiet work. I was paid on time, almost every time. I handed most of it over. Calvin called it contributing. A neutral word, like gravity. He said families pooled resources. He said adults didn't nickel and dime each other. The family account was always empty anyway, he added, like that settled the question. It never made sense. I watched money go in and never stay. Utilities were overdue. Groceries were rationed. Repairs were postponed. And yet boxes kept arriving, heavy ones. Tool brands printed in bold letters, engine parts, power equipment he didn't need yet, but might. Each purchase framed as an investment in future income that never arrived. When I asked about a bill, his face changed before his voice did. First irritation, then volume, then blame. Didn't I remember that unexpected repair last month? Hadn't my medical issue caused delays? Wasn't freelancing unstable by nature? He stacked explanations until they sounded like facts. My mother nodded beside him, already tired, already convinced the math was beyond her. He called me kid, not affectionately, strategically. a reminder that no matter my age, my position stayed lower. When relatives visited, he joked about me finding my footing, about how generous he was to keep me around while I figured things out. I learned when to stop speaking. The first time I mentioned moving out, the crisis arrived within hours. A contractor unpaid, a bank error, a surprise expense that required everyone to tighten belts, especially me. Calvin paced the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, performing urgency. My mother cried quietly. The implication was clear. Independence would collapse the system. So I stayed and watched. The credit score drop came without warning, a number sliding downward like a verdict. I called the bureau myself, sat on hold long enough to memorize the instrumental loop. Accounts I didn't recognize. Late payments I never authorized. An address typo that wasn't a typo at all, just far enough off to reroute mail. I didn't confront him. I opened a spreadsheet. Dates, lenders, cross-references. I pulled my old employment records, matched deposits to withdrawals. Found the pattern underneath the noise. Small charges that accumulated. Accounts opened when I was working double shifts. Signatures that look like mine if you didn't look too closely. Paper. Insurance doesn't feel dramatic while you're building it. It feels boring, administrative, like learning a foreign language you hope never to use. But it changes how you sit at the table, how you listen. You stop reacting and start recording. Calvin grew more confident as my questions stopped. He mistook silence for surrender. He bought more, spoke louder, started referring to the house as his in casual conversation. My mother didn't correct him. At night, I heard the garage door slam again, heard him counting under his breath, heard my name used like an expense category. I kept working, kept saving copies, backups of backups, cloud storage he didn't know existed. A small safe deposit box opened under a name he'd never searched for. By the time he noticed my credit score was no longer falling, he assumed it was another mistake in his favor. He laughed about it, said systems corrected themselves. They do, just not the way he thought. I wasn't trapped. I was waiting. Calvin isolated my mother the way moisture ruins wood, slowly, without spectacle, until the structure gives. At first, it was small embarrassments. A joke too sharp at a dinner party. A correction delivered loudly when Janet misremembered a detail. Friends stopped inviting her because Calvin made every room feel hostile, like a test no one had studied for. He criticized the wine, the chairs, the politics. By the third gathering, people learned to call less. Janet's body began to register the change before her mind did. Stomach pain that arrived without warning. Dizziness when she stood too quickly. A fatigue that didn't lift with sleep. She carried it quietly, like an obligation. When her doctor suggested tests, Calvin scoffed, said medicine liked to invent problems to justify invoices. He ordered natural supplements online instead. Brown bottles with green labels, words like detox and vitality printed in fonts meant to feel ancient. He lined them up on the counter and watched as she swallowed them, one by one, with lukewarm water. When she said they made her nauseous, he told her that was proof they were working. Within a few years, she looked smaller, her shoulders rounded, her hair thinned in places she tried to hide with careful styling. The woman who used to walk quickly through grocery aisles now leaned on the cart. Calvin noticed, but not with concern. He noticed the way people noticed depreciation. Lydia Harper, our neighbor, knocked one afternoon with a paper bag of lemons and a voice that carried authority without volume. "Retired nurse. Liver damage," she said plainly, after glancing at the bottles on the counter. Supplements weren't regulated the way people thought. Some did harm quietly, over time. Calvin stood in the doorway and smiled like he was indulging a child. Janet apologized to Lydia after she left. Not to Calvin, to the person who had tried to help. That was when his language shifted. He started saying assisted living the way other people said weather, casually, inevitable. He framed it as planning, preparing for the future. He spoke about facilities he'd researched, how expensive they were, how generous it would be to find something modest and close. I listened. I saved copies. The supplements receipts, the search history, the text messages where he complained about Janet's decline and asked what his options were. The drafts he never sent, still sitting in his email outbox, asking about guardianship. Paper. Insurance thickens fastest when people think they're alone. He proposed a road trip soon after. A long one. Scenic routes. Time to reconnect. He said a change of air might help her. He said it with a lightness that didn't reach his eyes. When I asked where they'd stay, he shrugged. We'll see how it goes. The phrase stayed with me. Everything could happen on a road like that. Missed exits, wrong turns, stories without witnesses. I insisted on packing her medications myself. Took photos of the labels, logged the dates, left copies with Lydia under the pretense of emergency contacts. Calvin watched me without commenting, the way people do when they plan to revisit a subject later. Janet hugged me before they left. She felt fragile, paper thin. She smelled like the lavender soap she'd used my entire childhood. She told me not to worry. She always did. The house was quiet after they drove away. No garage door slamming, no pacing, just the refrigerator cycling on and off like a heartbeat you don't trust. That night, I organized everything I had. Timelines, medical notes, financial records, intent. Not accusations, patterns. The kind that don't require raised voices to be understood. When they returned days later, Calvin looked irritated. Janet looked worse. I noted the tremor in her hands, the way she avoided eye contact, the way he answered questions meant for her. I added it to the file. He thought isolation meant control. He was wrong. He meant exposure. And I was finished waiting for him to realize it. Calvin left for a vintage car show 3 states away on a Thursday morning, taking the noise with him. The house exhaled after the garage door closed. I waited until the sound of the engine was memory. Then I went to the hallway office he kept locked and called records. I learned how to open the door the way people learn anything dangerous now, quietly, online, without asking permission. The video was 6 minutes long. The instructor's hands were steady. The lock clicked the way it does when it gives up rather than breaks. I paused once, listening. Nothing moved. The room smelled like paper and oil. File boxes stacked like bricks. A desk with shallow drawers that stuck if you pulled them too fast. I took photos before I touched anything. Habit. The marriages came first. 5 of them. Different counties, different last names. Each one folded into 3 to 5 years, like a template. I printed the docket summaries and lined them up. Protective orders in 2 states. Temporary restraining orders in another. Language repeated across filings. Financial coercion, intimidation, misrepresentation. The phrasing changed. The pattern didn't. He moved after each divorce. Not immediately. After the paperwork settled. After the accounts were closed and reopened. Always to a place where the trail thinned. I checked dates against addresses. They matched the years he'd told stories about starting over. Reinvention sounded admirable when you didn't know the cost. In the second drawer, I found credit cards in my name. Still warm, metaphorically. Recent charges. Tools. Fuel. A hotel deposit from the car show he was attending right now. There were loans, too. Small ones, meant to look harmless. Interest rates that punished delay. My signature floated at the bottom of the forms like a rumor. I didn't feel surprised. I felt precise. I photographed everything. Then I logged into my credit report again, now knowing where to look. Accounts I disputed before appeared with context. opened when I was working double shifts, renewed after my hospital stay. He'd timed them to distraction. In a file marked property, I found the emails. Drafts between Calvin and a local attorney discussing options for selling my father's house. Not yet sent, not yet approved. Language about clean title and expedited process. He wrote as if the house were already his to negotiate, as if my father's name were a technicality to be managed. I closed my eyes long enough to remember the driveway, the mailbox, the envelope in my father's hand. I added the emails to the archive. Paper. Insurance isn't dramatic. It's careful. It doesn't accuse. It arranges. By the time I finished, the folder had weight. Not emotional. Legal. I restored everything exactly as I'd found it. The lock clicked back into place like it had never been challenged. When Calvin returned, sunburned and irritated, he complained about traffic and gas prices. He asked if anything had happened while he was gone. No, I said. It was true in the narrow sense. The house was still standing. My mother was asleep in the other room, exhausted in a way that didn't recover overnight. He poured himself a drink and talked about a potential buyer for one of the cars. He talked about opportunity. I watched his hands, the watch, the practiced confidence. I thought about the women whose names I now knew, the pattern he mistook for fate. That night, I opened a safe deposit box under a name he'd never connected to me. I placed copies inside. Then I uploaded duplicates to a server outside his reach. Redundancy is respect for reality. By morning, I had frozen my credit, flagged the accounts, scheduled consultations without mentioning his name. The process felt orderly, corrective. Calvin still believed the room was locked. He still believed the past moved with him. He was wrong on both counts. I didn't rush. There was no need. The event would take care of the rest. I found the insurance policies on a Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet enough to hear intent. 3 life insurance contracts, all in my mother's name. Janet Brooks. Total coverage, $1.9 million. The beneficiary line was clean, singular, Calvin Moore. No contingencies, no secondary names, no trust provisions, just him. I sat at the desk and didn't move for a full minute. The printer hummed softly, idle, like it was waiting for instructions. The dates told their own story. Each policy opened after a medical episode, after the dizziness began, after the supplements replaced prescriptions. The premiums were set to autopay from accounts my mother no longer monitored. The signatures looked like hers if you didn't know her hand had started to shake. I checked the browser history next. The phrasing was careful at first. Questions framed like curiosity. Then it narrowed. Untraceable poisoning. Natural heart attack symptoms woman. Liver failure supplements. He didn't search often. He searched decisively, like someone who already knew what he wanted and needed confirmation, not advice. I scrolled without reacting. Reaction clouds documentation. There was a dating profile too, recently created. Status set to widowed. The photo was current, his new jacket, his practiced half smile. The bio talked about resilience, about rebuilding after loss. I saved it, timestamp included. In his email drafts, I found the funeral notes. They weren't poetic, they were logistical. Names, music suggestions, a preference for closed casket to preserve dignity, a line thanking friends for their support during a sudden but peaceful passing. He hadn't written my name anywhere. I closed the laptop carefully. Then I opened it again and photographed everything. Redundancy matters when stakes change. In the bathroom cabinet, I lined the supplement bottles up on the counter. Brown glass, green labels, words that promise balance and purity. I turned them until the ingredient lists faced the light, took photos, cross-referenced them later with medical warnings my mother's doctor had mentioned once, quietly, before Calvin dismissed him. In a separate drawer, I found prescriptions that weren't hers. Different dosage, different doctor. I photographed those too. Dates, refill intervals. I didn't taste anything. I didn't need to. Paper insurance reached a different density that week. It stopped being about money and became about time, about sequence, about proving that coincidence had been encouraged. Calvin started watching me more closely. He asked where I'd been going in the afternoons, why I was on my phone so much. He joked about secrets with a sharpness that wasn't humor, I answered neutrally. I kept my tone flat. He relaxed when people didn't challenge him. He always had. My mother slept longer, ate less. When she forgot words mid-sentence, Calvin answered for her. When Lydia knocked again, Calvin didn't open the door. He said interruptions were bad for recovery. I scheduled a consultation under my own name, then another under hers, with consent she gave in a moment of clarity Calvin wasn't present for. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I provided documents. Patterns speak faster than fear. The event invitation arrived a week later. A winter charity gala, black tie, held at a restored estate outside the city. Calvin said it would be good for morale, good to show unity. He said my mother would feel special. He ordered her a new dress in a color she never wore. I confirmed attendance. The night before, I packed a small folder and left it in my car. Not hidden, just placed. I charged my phone and backed up everything one last time. Then I slept. Calvin believed insurance was the endgame. He didn't understand it was just evidence with a schedule. I watched my mother breathe in her sleep, shallow but steady. I adjusted the blanket, not out of sentiment, out of precision. The next move wouldn't be private. It would be public. And it would be final. I reached Paula Finch through a court document older than my phone, a forwarding address that led to a voicemail greeting spoken slowly, like someone who'd learned to be careful with strangers. I left my name and nothing else. She called back the next morning. She didn't ask why. She asked how long it had been happening. We spoke in short segments, the way people do when they don't want to wake old rooms in their memory. Paula had been married to Calvin for 4 years. She described the arc without embellishment, charm, acceleration, consolidation. The money first, the isolation next, then the quiet rules. He used to make me drinks, she said. I stopped finishing them. She paused there. I let the silence do the work. One night, she continued, I watched him drop something in the glass. Not powder. Liquid. Clear. He smiled like he'd done me a favor. She never drank after that. She pretended to. She poured the rest down the sink when he wasn't looking. The headache stopped. The dizziness faded. The marriage didn't survive the question she began asking. Paula introduced me to the others. A private group chat. No names at first. Just initials and years, states, patterns. Once everyone realized the overlap, the tone changed. The same words appeared in different mouths, decades apart. The same fights, scripted. The same natural remedies. The same threats disguised as concern. He had married 5 times. He had rehearsed longer than that. We built a timeline together. Dates stacked like tiles, moves across state lines, credit activity that bloomed just before separation, insurance policies taken out during health scares. Each woman carried a piece of the shape without seeing the whole. Together, it aligned. Denise Walsh joined next, legal assistant. She didn't speak in paragraphs. She sorted. She labeled. She flagged inconsistencies and smiled only when something clicked into place. She taught us what mattered and what didn't. Hearsay versus pattern. Memory versus document. How to keep the chain clean, We didn't share feelings. We shared files. Paula uploaded photographs of supplement bottles from 10 years ago. The labels had changed color. The ingredients hadn't. Another woman added screenshots of emails with drafts eerily similar to the ones I'd found. Funeral logistics written early, saved late. Someone else posted a restraining order Calvin had violated without consequence because the address had already changed. 20 years. One method. I stayed careful at home. I kept my shoulders rounded. I spoke softly. I let Calvin explain things to me as if I didn't understand them. I asked questions that led nowhere and accepted answers that insulted my intelligence. He relaxed into it. Predators prefer predictability. When he called me kid, I smiled. When he criticized my work, I nodded. When he joked about my fragility, I laughed at the wrong moments. I became small enough to be ignored. At night, I uploaded files. Denise created folders. Paula annotated dates. We cross-checked cities with insurance filings. The group chat stopped feeling like a support line and started feeling like an archive. Paper insurance became plural. Calvin noticed nothing. He never had. He focused on the gala, on appearances, on rehearsing concern. He practiced lines in the mirror, how tired my mother looked, how brave she was. He ordered flowers. He selected music. He told people she'd been unwell but improving. He said it with conviction, like it made it true. I watched him pack his jacket the day before the event. He hummed. He checked his watch. He looked at my mother like a project nearing completion. I sent one last message to the group chat. A time, a place, a request to stand by. Paula replied with a single word. Ready. Denise added a checklist. I slept early that night. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional. I woke before dawn and dressed carefully. Neutral colors. Nothing that would draw comment. I took the small folder from my car and placed it back where it belonged. Calvin thought weakness was a fixed trait. He had never learned the difference between invisibility and patience. The event would teach him. I placed the cameras the way you place punctuation, where pauses reveal meaning. One inside an unused wall outlet behind the sideboard, another tucked into the smoke detector above the kitchen island. They were small enough to be ignored by anyone who believed the house belonged to him. I tested angles at night, adjusted for glare, learned the rhythm of the room. Nothing dramatic, just coverage. Calvin didn't change his habits. He never did. Confidence makes people repetitive. 3 days later, the footage gave me what intention alone never could. He stood at the counter with his back to the door, crushing a tablet between two spoons. Not hurried, not nervous. He tipped the powder into a glass already filled with ice and citrus, stirred once, and wiped the spoon on a towel. When he carried the drink to my mother, his voice softened. He told her it would help her sleep. The camera caught his hands. The rest filled itself in. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. I archived the clip and labeled it by date and time. Evidence doesn't rush. It waits to be contextualized. While the cameras recorded the house, the money told its own story elsewhere. Aaron Mills came recommended through Denise, IT specialist with a talent for following what people thought they'd buried. He worked quietly, asked for access I could legally grant, and spoke only when he had something solid. Calvin had been running investment groups for years. Informal, friendly. Promises framed as mentorship. Retirees and acquaintances pooled funds for opportunities that never materialized. The money moved, though, through shell accounts, into purchases, out again. Always just clean enough to pass a glance. Aaron traced the flow in an afternoon. The irony was almost professional. Calvin used the same password across accounts, a habit, a belief that control meant consistency. Aaron didn't comment on it. He just documented. I delayed the power of attorney the way people delay storms, with process. I asked for a lawyer to be present, requested additional review, claimed confusion. Calvin grew irritated but careful. He needed that signature to look voluntary. Pressure too early would show. While he waited, I notified the people who would need to know before he did. Local police, adult protective services. I didn't accuse. I submitted documentation, timelines, footage, financial anomalies, names of witnesses willing to speak. The system doesn't respond to anger. It responds to completeness. Calvin sensed something shifting. He started hovering, watching my hands when I packed my bag, asking where I was going, who I was meeting. I kept my answers vague, weak. I told him I was tired, that I trusted him to handle things. He relaxed again. He always did when offered permission. The cameras caught more, not just the powder, the conversations, the way he spoke to my mother when he thought no one could hear, the way he rehearsed concern, the way he described the future as if it were already missing her. I backed everything up twice, then a third time. I labeled each file without adjectives, dates, times, locations, names, paper. Insurance doesn't editorialize. The night before the gala, Calvin practiced his speech in the living room. He talked about resilience, about gratitude, about family pulling together. I sat on the stairs and listened, my face neutral, my posture small. When he finished, he smiled at me like a manager pleased with a quiet employee. "You'll be okay tomorrow," he said. "Just stick close." I nodded. The trap didn't need bait. It needed lighting. At the event, the house would be full. Witnesses dressed in black and gold. A stage. A screen meant for donors and photographs. The kind of place where truth feels disruptive because it's well lit. I slept that night with my phone charging beside me and the cameras still rolling. My mother breathed unevenly in the next room. I checked on her once, adjusted the blanket. Not for sentiment, for record. By morning, everything was in place. Calvin believed control meant secrecy. He never understood it meant documentation with an audience. I dressed carefully, took one last look at the house, and turned the cameras off. The rest would happen in public. They came early, while the house still held the shape of sleep. 2 police officers and an adult protective services caseworker stood on the porch with clipboards and practiced calm. I opened the door without surprise. Janet was still in bed, breathing shallowly, her face turned toward the window as if light might explain what had been happening to her body. They spoke to her first, slowly, with names and dates and questions that didn't rush. The caseworker knelt so they were eye level. My mother nodded when she could, shook her head when she couldn't. When they asked about the supplements, she looked toward the kitchen without understanding why. The bottles were sealed into evidence bags one by one, brown glass disappearing behind plastic, labels photographed, lot numbers logged. The house felt smaller as the cabinets emptied, like a stage being cleared. Janet left on a stretcher, not because she couldn't walk, but because procedure mattered now. The ambulance doors closed with a sound that didn't echo. I watched it pull away and felt nothing sharp enough to call relief. Calvin was arrested 3 hours later in a gravel parking lot outside a vintage car fair. He was mid-sentence when they approached him, hands gesturing, watch flashing. He tried to smile first, then explain. He called it a misunderstanding. He asked to make a call. He asked if this could wait. When the cuffs went on, the crowd leaned in. Phones came out. The word fraud travels quickly when people think it won't touch them. He didn't look for me. Maybe he thought I'd be too weak to follow. Maybe he still believed his version would hold. It didn't. By afternoon, others had stepped forward. People with similar stories, similar timelines, similar losses explained away as bad luck. Retirement accounts drained through investment groups. Credit cards opened and closed in cycles. Houses refinanced and sold just before signatures were questioned. The inventory grew. Cars from the fair were impounded before sunset. Titles flagged, assets frozen. The watch disappeared into a bag like the supplements had. When the lab results came back, they didn't dramatize them. They didn't need to. The substance found caused slow organ failure, designed to mimic natural decline, effective over time, hard to trace unless someone was looking for exactly that. Someone had been. I visited Janet in the hospital that evening. She looked smaller without the bottles, but clearer. Her eyes tracked me when I entered. She asked where Calvin was. "Not here," I said. She nodded once. The machines filled the space between us with sound. She didn't ask anything else. Outside the room, an officer asked if I was ready to make a statement. I handed him a folder instead. Paper insurance, fully assembled. He flipped through it without comment, then looked at me differently. By nightfall, the news had moved on to other things. Arrests don't stay interesting when they aren't spectacular. Calvin would learn that later. For now, the system took over, slow and methodical. I went home alone. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned. No pacing, no slammed doors, just rooms returning to their original size. I packed one bag. Not everything, just enough. I left the rest where it was. Evidence had its own destinations now. Before I closed the door, I turned back once. The hallway office stayed locked. It didn't matter anymore. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, unclaimed. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Freedom, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the absence of a weight you carried long enough to mistake for your own spine. I walked to my car and drove without checking the mirror. The road didn't ask where I'd been. It only opened. After the storm, the damage revealed itself by what stopped hurting. Janet's recovery wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no declarations of strength. She simply began waking up earlier, asking for real food, walking the hallway without holding the rail. When the supplements were gone, her body corrected itself with the quiet confidence of something that had been interrupted, not broken. Color returned to her face. Her hands stopped trembling. She started finishing sentences again. Calvin did not. The trial moved the way truth often does in America. Slow, procedural, indifferent to emotion. Fraud, attempted murder, identity theft, assault. Each charge arrived with documentation instead of outrage. He listened as numbers were read aloud. Dates, names, medical results. He tried once to look at me. I didn't meet his eyes. The verdict wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sentence settled into the room like gravity. Years measured without metaphor. The kind that don't negotiate. The house stayed. That mattered more than people realized. It meant my father's name didn't get erased by paperwork. It meant memory stayed anchored to a place instead of a box. We changed the locks, opened windows, let the rooms relearn air. I didn't move back in. I began working with organizations that understood the kind of damage that doesn't bruise skin. Domestic violence isn't always a raised hand. Financial abuse isn't always theft you can point to immediately. Sometimes it's attrition, access, exhaustion disguised as care. I helped where I could, documents, process, quiet explanations. I never used Calvin's name. I didn't need to. The women stayed in touch, Paula, Denise, the others. We didn't call it a support group. We called it dinner when schedules aligned, messages when they didn't. No hierarchy, no leader, just shared fluency in what had happened and what never should again. Family, stripped of obligation and rebuilt on consent. One afternoon, I ran into Megan Lewis at a coffee shop near the hospital. Same posture, same calm. She recognized me immediately. We didn't hug. We didn't talk about the ER. We exchanged a look that acknowledged sequence, cause and effect. She nodded once. I nodded back. It was enough. Janet asked once if I hated him. I thought about it carefully. Hate requires attention. I told her the truth. No. She accepted that. We've learned to accept clean answers. Life didn't become inspirational. It became accurate. Bills arrived and were paid. Work stayed work. Sleep came without calculation. Silence returned to its original function. Not fear, not strategy, just space. I stopped collecting evidence. The habit lingered for a while, like a reflex. Then it faded. Paper insurance only matters when you're being denied reality. When reality reasserts itself, the paper rests. Sometimes I drive past the courthouse without noticing it. Sometimes I remember and keep driving anyway. The road no longer feels like escape. It feels like direction. This is what I know now, and it's simple enough to be mistaken for nothing. In America, violence doesn't always leave fingerprints on skin. Sometimes it lives in accounts, contracts, and carefully managed silence. But truth leaves residue. It accumulates. It waits. And when it surfaces, it doesn't ask for forgiveness. It just stands. I don't look back anymore. Not because I'm brave, because there's nothing there that owns me. The storm passed. What remained was mine.